These experiences set me on the path I continue to traverse to this day. I do not mean this metaphorically. My engagement with radical politics began. I can still remember encountering Professor Wamba Diawamba in a seminar on Central African history. This was just a year after the war that ended the reign of Mobutu Sese Seko in neighboring Zaire, as it was known then. As most of you, I'm sure, are aware, by the end of the academic year, Wamba Diawamba would go on to lead an insurgency, an experience that stimulated my lifelong interest in conflict and peace. My connection to UDSM also enabled me to begin graduate studies in the United States. After graduating from Tufts University with a mediocre GPA, I had a little idea about what my path forward beyond a desire to return to Africa. In 2000, after a summer spent working for a Nigerian human rights organization during the post-Abacha transition, I returned to New York with no plan for what I was going to do next. Elaine Wamba encouraged me to reach out to Professor Mahmoud Mamdani, who had just arrived at Columbia University. I believe he agreed to hire me as an assistant and work with me as a PhD student due to my familiarity with this campus, which he of course taught at during a formative period in his own journey. When I returned to Chuo during the 2012-2013 academic year to teach in the Department of Political Science as a Fulbright scholar, I was troubled by the changes I observed. Class sizes had exploded, an inevitable result of the student population almost quadrupling, even as the academic staff grew much slower, not even doubling during the same period. Faculty were overworked and underpaid. Many needed to take second jobs as administrators or work as consultants in order to make a living. These realities inevitably impacted their teaching and research. This story, as we all know, was not unique to this campus. Across Africa, education and universities in particular have been under assault for decades. The neoliberal era has been devastating for African higher education, and the figures about productivity I cited earlier only capture part of the story. Top scholars from African institutions have been forced to find work abroad. Those who remain take on additional jobs to supplement their diminishing pay. How did we arrive at this situation? I want to provide my interpretation of the past before I say anything about the future. One of the most important lessons I took from my time at Chuo was how broader changes at the national and international level can impact the nature of knowledge production on a specific campus. In 1997 and 1998, many of the professors I had the privilege of engaging with at UDSM were perceptively critiquing the neoliberalization of the university that was then unfolding. They warned that the changes being wrought at UDSM and other universities across the continent would have transformative effects far beyond campus. And they were right. In many ways, this period was a return to the colonial past. Higher education in Africa originates within an imperial project, one intimately tied to Western power with transformative consequences for every aspect of African youth societies. As part of their so-called civilizing mission, especially under direct rule, European colonialists sought to create a modern native elite that could bring along the rest of the population into a distinct form of colonial modernity. As Thomas Mampilly, a British colonial administrator in India, infamously put it in his Minute on Education, written in the 1930s, quote, "We must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern. A class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in moral, and in intellect." This desire to create a colonized elite explicitly shaped colonial education systems. In Africa, the decision to shift from direct rule to indirect modes of governance meant that the project of colonial education focused on higher education, where the European powers established remote campuses of their major university systems. These campuses were designed to be accessible to only a tiny portion of the population, and as independence drew near, became increasingly resented by their colonial founders for their role in nationalist agitations. It was often this tiny, educated elite who emerged at the forefront of nationalist movements. an unintended consequence that reveals the limits of how knowledge production will always transcend any efforts to regulate it. Importantly, many of the opposition leaders who became the primary threat to the founding generation of African political elites also shared a similar background. As African nations emerged from colonial domination, the majority adopted political institutions modeled on Western forms of government, including constitutions, parliaments, political parties, and civil services. Participation in both government and opposition required Western education, a dynamic memorably captured by Chinua Achebe in his 1966 novel, A Man of the People, which centered on a conflict between a former teacher who becomes a government minister and his former student who teaches at the same school. What made post-independence African societies somewhat distinctive is the frequency of left-wing resistance, even where the governments claim to be advancing progressive causes, as in the case of Tanzania. Mwalimu Nyerere, rightly hailed as among the most thoughtful and dedicated leaders of Africa's post-independence left, was also known for his contentious relationship to Tanzanian civil society. In particular, he clashed regularly with students and intellectuals, many of whom challenged his repressive tendencies and disagreed with his approach to building a distinctive form of African socialism. One of the more prominent examples of this dynamic was Nyerere's response to students and faculty right here at Chuo. During the 1960s, left-wing students at UDSM, including many with roots from outside Tanzania, were drawn to more radical internationalist struggles for socialism and chafed at Nyerere's nationalist vision for the university. By the late 1960s, these tensions came to a head, leading the ruling party to try and assert more control over the university and student activism in particular. As he did with other left-wing critics and organizations, Nyerere shut down the university's Students' African Revolutionary Front, the primary space in which radical students and faculty gathered, as well as the student-led journal Cheche. In addition, foreign faculty, including Walter Rodney, who was then a lecturer, were chastised for promoting armed struggle against neo-colonial exploiters, according to Luc Melchior, who has documented this period. Writing in Cheche shortly before the crackdown, the great Issa Shivji, then a student at UDSM and a member of USARF, explained why the Tanzanian government feared student radicals. And I quote, "In fact, the winning over of the newly educated elite is a serious preoccupation of the ruling bureaucracy. This is, of course, to deprive the masses of a possible revolutionary leadership, for the educated elite happens to be the only stratum in the underdeveloped countries well placed to provide such leadership." Professor Shivji points to the centrality of education in creating a democratic opposition and a robust civil society in African states. Through the 1980s, the educated elite dominated positions within government, as well as within civil society, through their participation in radical civil society organizations. What is distinctive about this group is that they did not derive their elite status through corporate positions, nor were they holders of traditional privilege, though many were the children of traditional elites, even as they embraced modern forms of dress and demeanor. Rather, they share more in common with what has been referred to in Western society as the meritocratic elite, in that they derive power from their presumed acquisition of valuable skills as demonstrated by their ability to complete a university education. In post-colonial Africa, the ability to attend tertiary education is extremely limited and remains low to this day. This oppositional role for educated elites began to change as neoliberalism swept through the continent. The story of neoliberalism's impact on African society and politics is well known by now. Faced with the growing debt crisis triggered by the surging cost of oil in the 1970s, African governments borrowed heavily from both international financial institutions and private sources. In exchange, most were required to engage in austerity programs that dramatically slashed public spending for state-provided services. Governments that once pursued ambitious development programs were critiqued as corrupt and ineffective. With structural adjustment, money left to African governments was earmarked to service the debt burden, leading to massive cuts in social spending. The impact of these policies were felt widely, but particularly at institutions of higher education. As the public sector shrank, foreign donors and international NGO agencies redirected their funds to non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that came to function as a replacement to the university-led civil society of the immediate post-independent period. As Africa's educated populations were turned away from a diminished and reoriented academy in neoliberalism's wake, they found sustenance in the sprawling NGO sector. NGOs, flush with cash from state development agencies and private donors, required a broad and qualified labor source. Initially, expatriate workers from North America and Europe flooded in, setting up expansive and segregated communities within desirable locales across Africa's urban metropolises. But as the sector exploded, the combination of lower wages required for hiring local employees and the perceived neocolonial dynamics of having Westerners taking the lead in African development led to a push for what has variously been called localization, indigenization, or Africanization of NGO workforces, ultimately pressuring the sector to hire more educated Africans. This demand for educated African labor produced an exodus away from other civil society sites that Africa's elites once populated, including the university. As Yen explains, quote, NGO development has served as a safety net for the African petit bourgeois to survive and maintain their livelihood in the midst of the most appalling economic conditions. The question we must ask is, how has the NGOization of civil society in Africa and the corresponding diminishment of the university as the premier site of opposition impacted larger trends in African political and economic life? To appreciate the replacement of universities by NGOs within African civil society, it is useful to ask what role civil society is theorized to play versus its actual impact on African political life. In the liberal model, civil society occupies the third sector that can regulate both the market and the state. Civil society, it is claimed, draws its power not from the monopoly on violence, like the state, nor from its control over economic life, like the market. Rather, civil society is claimed to derive its power from the people and serves to mediate the relations with the other two sectors. In its idealized form, civil society is viewed as a cornerstone of democratic life through its role in enhancing popular representation, bringing in the voices of the marginalized, monitoring government and corporate activities, transforming cultural norms, and most impactfully, providing a locus for active citizenship. In these ways, and in contrast to the hierarchical structure of government and the market, civil society is imagined as a horizontal space in which individuals derive power from their positions as representatives of an imagined community of citizens. It is the only space in which class is no longer relevant, or more accurately, a space that favors the marginalized due to it being the only sector where they are not actively prohibited from participation. A number of scholars and activists have long bemoaned the impact of the rise of NGOs on African politics and society. Feroz Manji and Carol O'Coyle, for example, argue that NGOs operate in a fashion akin to the missionaries who supported the European colonization of Africa. In their view, NGOs have, quote, taken the missionary position. Service delivery, running projects that are motivated by charity, pity, and doing things for people, implicitly who can't do it for themselves. This leads, according to Manji and O'Coyle, to, quote, undermining the struggle of African people to emancipate themselves. But the impact of NGOs on African opposition goes beyond its immediate impact on African civil society. NGOs also transform the subjectivity of their African laborers. By this, I mean to ask how workers within the NGO sector understand themselves. To answer this, it is important to emphasize that civil society, the NGO, like civil society, the NGO is a European import to Africa, not an indigenous creation, as Partha Chatterjee reminds us. They are a part of a larger package of modernity imposed on African societies, first in the name of civilization, and then in the name of development. There are two related ways that this manifests. First, NGO elites rarely embrace a radical nationalist consciousness of the sort that motivated students and faculty activists in the immediate post-independence era. Instead, as a result of their dependence on global sources of funding and direction, they come to embrace a Western liberal consciousness, one reinforced at conferences and workshops held in multiple locations across the world, but especially in global north locales. Second, in contrast to the liberal vision of civil society as a horizontal space, NGO elites operate transversely, deriving status by claiming to represent marginalized Africans within elite spaces. Since the independence period, African scholars and political thinkers have questioned categories such as civil society and class, and whether they can be productively applied to the African context. Figures like Frantz Fanon, Kwame Nkrumah, and Amilcar Cabral challenged the idea that African political elites could truly wield power in a neo-colonial global order. Cabral, for example, referred to African political elites as, quote, a neo-colonial pseudo-bourgeoisie, controlled by the ruling class of the dominated country, while Nkrumah warned of, quote, puppet governments that do the bidding of their neo-colonial masters. Of concern was the continued control over Africa's economic productivity by foreign powers, rendering elites in African countries the product of external machinations rather than internal power dynamics. As Professor Shivji summarized in 1973, quote, when one talks about class struggle in Tanzania, one cannot but analyze the international scene. Elites are often understood as individuals or groups of individuals who acquire resources that enable them to exert disproportionate amounts of power and influence within a society. In African countries, where access to higher education remains a valuable and scarce resource, educated individuals have long benefited from elite status. While the importance of education in creating a post-colonial African elite is well established in the literature, the question of what role are educated elites playing in African politics today remains unaddressed. I argue that as neoliberalism decimated higher education while bolstering NGOs, civil society lost its capacity to serve as a democratic counterforce to the state and the market. In contrast to earlier eras, educated elites in Africa today are more likely to be found within the booming NGO sector rather than participating in other civil society sectors, which have witnessed a corresponding decline in their influence. In order to make sense of what we can call the NGO elite in Africa, it is necessary to answer three questions. First, what gives them power? Second, how does their participation in this class impact their subjectivity and ideological orientation? And third, what impact do they have on African politics and society today? The concept of an NGO elite names a phenomenon that scholars have long highlighted in regards to African NGO workers. For example, Julie Hearn draws on radical thinkers like Frantz Fanon to compare African NGO workers to the neo-colonial elite, who are given the trappings of power without possessing controls over the means of production. She argues that as a result, NGO workers have come to function as a comprador class, calling attention to their financial and political dependency on the global north, a situation that leaves them without the power required to act independently of their financial sponsors. For Hearn, the, quote, lack of an independent source of funding and status for NGO workers, and the fact that they play a, quote, key intermediary role linking the North and South, ideologically and materially perpetuates Northern domination. She summarizes the situation this way, quote, within African civil society, imperial power does not need to take the form of overt external domination when there's an array of indigenous actors arguing the same case and implementing it as well as acting as a presence to diffuse any latent opposition. This structural assessment of the role of NGOs does not address a common objection, often articulated by African NGO workers. Specifically, while NGOs may play a role in neo-colonial domination, the individual African workers they rely on do not share this ideological position. Rather, the twin discourses of Africanization and localization explicitly argue that replacing Global North NGO workers with African workers will transform NGOs into champions of ordinary Africans, replacing a neo-colonial logic with one that foregrounds the interests of Africa's marginalized populations. By localizing or Africanizing the workforce, it is argued, NGOs will no longer be prone to the cultural blind spots and prejudices that even the best intentioned foreign workers were likely to carry with them. These include the excessive costs of paying foreign workers, their limited capacity to respond to the numerous crises unfolding, the hierarchical nature of funding, the long-term sustainability of NGO projects, and most relevantly, the paternalistic nature of the aid enterprise itself, by giving Africans a greater say in their agendas. The core claims of advocates of localization is that African NGO workers possess a distinct subjectivity that would allow them to redress some of the critiques leveled against NGOs run by foreign workers. By hiring Africans to replace foreigners, NGOs would be more nimble, efficient, politically engaged, and better capable of subverting some of the hierarchical logics that led to the accusation of NGOs operating in a neo-colonial fashion. In addition, while the idea of white saviors transforming African societies easily evoked images of colonial missionary societies, the idea of Africans helping themselves through the work of NGOs alluded to a nationalist consciousness, especially prominent during the post-independence period, in which replacing foreign workers with locals was perceived as a necessary step towards decolonization and popular sovereignty. Yet, despite the hype around the localization agenda, there are reasons to question this narrative. Most directly, the promise of localization, both during the post-independence period or more recently, overstates the political potential of what is fundamentally a form of representation politics. The idea that the mere presence of black and brown faces will inevitably lead to political change. As figures like Nkrumah and Cabral warned in an earlier era, replacing Europeans with Africans does nothing to change the political economy driving Africa's marginalization and democratic backsliding. African NGOs remain reliant on external funders, who themselves must abide by the national policies implemented by the governments of countries they seek to work in. More African NGO workers does nothing to transform this reality. Promoters of localization also fail to account for the impact of organizational socialization on workers, regardless of the color of their skin. At a basic level, it has long been recognized that newcomers to any organization undergo a process through which they acquire the requisite knowledge and social norms to be successful by the organization's standards. In other words, how to become an insider. To be clear, this begins prior to hiring. A key force in the transformation of African universities discussed above was a desire to turn African students into productive workers within a globalizing economy. The rise of management programs and other technocratic departments at African universities in the wake of structural adjustment produced a generation of workers with skills demanded by the private sector. But due to the relatively small number of jobs available in African corporations, such technocratic workers more commonly found employment within development and humanitarian-focused NGOs. As they enter the NGO workforce, these workers are further transformed in subtle but often substantive ways. For example, NGOs often claim to rely on technocratic approaches that transcend political divides. The development discourse, in particular, is rife with language that eschews political engagement in favor of what works, by which they mean programs designed to avoid the complications of entering the political realm in favor of projects that maximize individual livelihoods. Even rights-based organizations work to shift the subjectivity of their workers. Many NGOs rely on discourses of human versus civil rights and orient their workers to make claims not on national governments, but towards unaccountable international bodies. Finally, localization advocates do not pay attention to questions of class. Again, it is useful to return to earlier concerns about the intersection of race and class and how this shapes political subjectivities, especially on the left. For example, in his 1970 book, Class Struggle in Africa, Kwame Nkrumah reflected on what he called the class-race aspect of the African workers' struggle, arguing that it, quote, tends to blunt the awareness of the workers to the existence of indigenous bourgeois exploitation. For Nkrumah, xenophobia against Lebanese, Indian, and even other African workers of the sort that we are seeing in South Africa today resulted from the misplaced anger directed towards foreigners rather than African elites, thereby preventing the emergence of an indigenous working class consciousness that could unite groups across racial and national boundaries. Nkrumah's writing follows many scholars and political thinkers of the time in assuming that the burgeoning post-independence African elite drive their power by taking over political and economic positions left behind by European colonizers. Nkrumah's discussion of the post-colonial elite more accurately describes the material position of today's NGO elites compared to dominant liberal theories. The imagined horizontal nature of civil society is at odds with the reality of employment in the NGO sector, which is often understood correctly as a route to the African upper classes. Entire economies ranging from schools, gated communities, and businesses have emerged to cater to the NGO elite in African cities. Only rarely do NGO workers understand themselves as part of Africa's marginalized masses, favoring instead a self-perception that aligns them with the globalized civil society elite that is increasingly prominent in countries across the global south. The incorporation of educated Africans into global civil society networks has transformed opposition politics on the continent. Rather than the crude repression favored by governments or economic exploitation pursued by corporate leaders, NGO elites contribute to the depoliticization of African political struggles by advancing technocratic approaches designed to uphold the inequitable incorporation of African societies into the global economy. In contrast to earlier eras, when many of Africa's educated elites gravitated towards institutions of higher education or varying forms of oppositional politics, today's professionalized elites are more likely to be ensconced in privileged NGO networks that advocate fundamentally reformist approaches that undermine Africa's rich history of radical oppositional struggles. I don't mean to position the rise of NGOs as the source of all of Africa's challenges. We know they are not. But it is worth asking what kind of democratic futures await African countries as the neoliberal era, in which NGOs are the most visible manifestation, draws to a close. This has been reported as a tragedy for African countries in much of the Western press. The underlying assumption is that African countries require Western intervention in order to address the basic needs of their populations. I want to offer a different take. My own sense is that with the waning of global North support for the NGO sector, most dramatically evident in Donald Trump's impulsive decision to shut down the United States Agency for International Development, is that we are entering a new era where African knowledge producers must reassert their premier position within African civil society. The end of American hegemony globally and the decline of foreign aid in Africa specifically will define the next era for African intellectuals. It is a fraught moment that could witness a further retreat of Africa's democratic energies and supercharge the extractive logic that have fueled Africa's growing inequality problem. Yet, there is an alternative. African intellectuals have the potential to rejuvenate African knowledge production by grounding it in the popular struggles currently unfolding across the continent. These struggles, often dismissively referred to as Gen Z protests, have been ongoing for almost 2 decades now and show little signs of slowing down. The activists who bravely take to the streets are hungry for intellectual engagement, direction, and solidarity from intellectuals within civil society. And yet, in too many cases, they find themselves alone. Examining the role of NGO workers in recent African protests helps illustrate the gap between their populist rhetoric and their actual engagement with popular movements. Even as African NGOs claim to advance democracy, human rights, and development, they have rarely participated directly in the recent wave of popular social movements that have erupted in African countries over the past 2 decades. This contrasts poorly with the role of university faculty and students in the immediate post-independence period that I discussed earlier. For example, in places like Senegal, Congo, Uganda, South Africa, and beyond, NGOs have generally avoided directly supporting popular movements that have sought to challenge creeping authoritarianism, economic inequality, and state violence. This is not incidental to NGOs, but structural, as they could face severe consequences to their legal status or funding arrangements if they are perceived as supporting popular movements. Indeed, among Africa's recent protest wave, it is only in countries where NGOs have had a limited presence due to international sanctions that we see educated elites participating directly in mass movements. Sudan's 2019 protests that led to the overthrow of the authoritarian regime of Omar al-Bashir, for example, harken back to an earlier period in which educated elites aligned with the masses to advance radical agendas. Professional associations, including those requiring elite education, such as associations representing journalists, doctors, and lawyers, were regular participants in the 2019 protests through the auspices of the Sudanese Professionals Association. In contrast to much of the continent, Sudan's decades-long status as a pariah state insulated it from the pressures of neoliberalism. Without access to loans from international financial institutions and cut off from the rise of NGOs due to internal government restrictions, the country's educated professionals never transformed into an NGO elite. But outside of such cases, the more common story of NGOs' role in recent African popular movements is to pressure protesters into concessions with backsliding and authoritarian regimes, or to avoid involvement altogether. This has not gone unnoticed, as my research on youth activism reveals. Indeed, in many countries, new forms of oppositional politics that are replacing the older NGOs and political parties are beginning to congeal as a result. Gen Z protests in Kenya have been led by youth from low-income backgrounds, as have the protests led by the former rapper Bobby Wine in Uganda. Earlier social movements in places like Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Nigeria, and Senegal were also led by musicians, despite the prevalence of NGOs in each. In Kenya, the backlash against NGOs led to the development of a network of over 40 social justice centers that explicitly reject the NGO model. This network has been at the center of recent agitations, while more mainstream organizations have avoided direct involvement with the protests. As Kinuthia Ndungu, a Kenyan intellectual and activist with the Kasarani Social Justice Center, notes, and I quote, "Kenya's human rights organizations that partner with international donors and Western embassies engage professional consultants to conduct background assessments and develop strategic plans for social movements. This is aimed at controlling and sabotaging the formation of formidable, radical social and political forces from the grassroots. The aims of these donor NGOs operating under the guise of human rights and freedom is to diffuse political anger and blunt the edges of political resistance." Similarly, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, leaders of Lucha, a youth movement that has been active for over a decade, reject collaboration with, or even comparison to NGOs, which they view as central to the functioning of Congolese civil society. As Rebecca Kabuo, a Lucha leader, explained to me in a 2023 interview, quote, "If we take money from NGOs, we have to follow their rules. We have to put up their banners. We don't need to depend on NGOs because we have our own ideology, and they have theirs." In recurring conversations with African activists over the past decade, the overwhelming consensus towards NGOs is that they dominate African civil society today so thoroughly as to be synonymous with it. NGOs and their African workforce are regularly perceived by activists as eschewing involvement in national politics, ensconcing themselves in elite and global networks instead. They are also portrayed as serving to demobilize radical energies, particularly among the youth, by discouraging more direct forms of popular agitation. Engagement with the NGO sector is perceived as a necessary evil, and many refuse any relationship outright. Indeed, disagreements between activists around collaboration with domestic and foreign NGOs is a frequent source of tension within many of these movements, particularly for resource-poor groups who would benefit from the funding streams controlled by Africa's NGO elite. The overwhelming picture by activists that I've spoken with is that NGOs cannot play the role of a democratic opposition amidst increasing authoritarianism across the continent. The re-emergence of popular movements that explicitly reject the neoliberal NGO model is a call from the streets to imagine a new and rejuvenated role for African civil society amidst the decline of the Western liberal order. That the Western liberal order is ending is no longer controversial. Western liberalism as a guiding principle for the international order is exhausted. Economically, China has demonstrated the superiority of its development model. Politically, Western liberalism could never resolve its fundamental contradictions with capitalism. Liberalism's failed attempt to reconcile political equality with economic inequality has reached a dead end. Across the West, we are living within world historical levels of economic inequality. In the United States, the Mad King and his merry band of degenerate billionaires have increased their control over most political institutions, much of the media, and increasingly civil society, including many of our most celebrated universities. Resistance in the West has been enfeebled. Opposition parties, journalists, and academics pose little challenge to our increasingly venal leaders, and many are enthralled to the same donor class. Those who do raise their voices, most visibly against the US-backed genocide in Gaza, are deplatformed, rendered unemployable, or increasingly imprisoned. The vision of this billionaire class is clear: a world without humans, or one in which the majority of humanity is rendered superfluous. What the past few decades of neoliberalism has taught us is that rather than an exception, global elites view the experiences of marginalized Africans as the ultimate endpoint, the model for most of the human population. What is unclear is what this means for knowledge production and the future development of the social sciences in Africa and beyond. As I've recounted above, the neoliberalization of African civil society has been detrimental to African political development. Across the continent, we are witnessing the rollback of hard-fought democratic freedoms. Inequality is spiking, with 9 of the 12 most unequal countries in the world now located in Africa. This includes fairly wealthy countries like South Africa and Botswana, but also extremely poor countries like the Central African Republic. Climate change is unrelenting, and populations across the continent are bearing the brunt. Genocidal wars seek to remake the world to favor the already privileged. But I wouldn't be here if I thought the future was predetermined. The great Nigerian musician Fela Kuti always said, quote, "Africa is the future." This was an ambiguous statement at the time, and is perhaps even more so now. But I always believed that Fela was correct in recognizing that the future of humanity, just as the past, is African. Demographically, this is obvious, as Africa continues to grow unlike almost every other continent in the world. By 2050, 1 of every 4 humans on the planet will be African. The future of African knowledge production, then, is the future of human knowledge production. As the West recedes deeper into a seemingly irreversible structural crisis, African intellectuals must develop new and better ways for understanding our shared social and natural worlds. Here is where I think African knowledge producers, both within and outside the university, and ideally working together, can begin to stitch together the nationalist and Pan-Africanist coalitions that came together to overthrow European colonialism in the first place. Coalitions which continue to inspire progressive movements around the world to this day. Neoliberal education is designed to funnel workers into the capitalist system by attempting to resolve the tension between capitalism and democracy. Capitalism produces inequality as the rewards of a capitalist system inevitably accumulates to the capitalist class. The fear for elites in a capitalist society is that a growing and permanent inequality can fuel political resistance. Neoliberal education works to train workers to fill positions as managers of capital. Such a system is designed to reward individuals by enabling them to rise above their birth status. But it cannot reconcile the underlying contradiction between capitalism and democracy. Unlike NGOs that seek to transform the population according to vague and imperfect international standards, or neoliberal universities that seek to ameliorate the negative effects of a capitalist economic system, organic knowledge producers generate knowledge that is relevant to and reflective of their distinctive circumstances. They are socially embedded within the societies that they seek to represent. And the knowledge they produce reflects the values and the norms of the societies they participate in. As it did during the struggle against colonialism and in the immediate post-independence period, African higher education must reconnect with these distinctively African forms of knowledge production. These never disappeared, but rather moved onto the street and other sites unfavored by neoliberal policies. In Kenya, the Organic Intellectual Network works to build connections across popular struggles and historical eras by producing and self-publishing texts on the nationalist era and their relevance for today. I have seen and participated in similar initiatives undertaken by popular movements in Senegal, Nigeria, and even the Democratic Republic of Congo. The goal is not to publish papers in Western academic journals that erect expensive paywalls that limit the dissemination of ideas beyond privileged institutions. Rather, it is to demonstrate to ordinary people how knowledge shapes the social world, and hence how access to knowledge in all its forms is the only proven method for upending a world order that is determined to drive us all towards collective destruction. What is missing in this promising effort to reconstitute organic African knowledge production is a substantive connection to African universities, one that would fuel the kind of popular scholarly engagement I was privileged to witness during my first sojourn at UDSM in the 1990s. African knowledge production must no longer be shaped by the needs of Western capitalism. African universities must move away from a purely technocratic approach designed to soften the effects of neoliberal capitalism towards one that reinforces its central position within a distinctively African civil society. African knowledge producers must find ways to challenge the dominance of Western ideas and ideals that have far too long limited the horizons of the human imagination. They must build relationships across colonial borders, class and linguistic divides that prevent truly Pan-African collaboration and networks. And they must engage with knowledge production emanating from other marginalized sites in Asia, Latin America, and among minoritized populations in the West. These are tall orders, and the stakes have never been higher. But the infrastructure is improving. For the past 5 years, I have worked with colleagues in Africa and beyond through the Program on African Social Research, one of very many initiatives working to reconstitute and disseminate African knowledge production globally, including those run by Codesria, the Social Science Research Council, the West African Research Association, and many others. This work has taken me across Africa, where I've been privileged to see a reemergence of debates around the politics of knowledge production, and importantly, organic initiatives designed to bridge the street and the university. The challenges are great, but our commitment must be greater. As the hegemony of the West recedes further into the past, We must not allow a new hegemonic power, whether China or anyone else, to simply take its place. Knowledge production must serve humanistic and progressive goals that rescue our species and the planet from the forces of